Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Dr. Fu. We're going to carry on and embark on our next module, which is research questions and hypotheses. This should align itself very well after our introduction and purpose statement lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. So, one key component of a successful research project is to turn your big topic into testable research questions. So, imagine if your very initial topic of interest in research is to dig deeper into the bibliotherapy literature and explore its potential application on treating perfectionism. You can use the funnel approach, starting from that big topic and then narrow it down as we've talked about before. Start to ask yourself, what is it about bibliotherapy and perfectionism that I'm interested to know more about and that would contribute to the literature that in a way it hasn't been done before? You might then realize you're really interested in exploring further the use of bibliotherapy as an alternative for therapy for treating maladaptive perfectionism. So, in that case, there are many questions that you can develop within the scope of that topic. For instance, one question you can ask in terms of a research question is, how effective is bibliotherapy alone in treating maladaptive perfectionism in the short term, within 6 months of doing the intervention, as opposed to the effects of face to face individual therapy? So, I know that was a mouthful, but bear with me. Another question you can ask is, how effective is bibliotherapy at decreasing stress and negative affect for maladaptive perfectionists versus non perfectionists? Okay. So, one tip that I would offer is for you to go from a very general topic of research, wherever you're at right now, and then follow it down by asking yourself, why is it important to study whatever your topic is? Just keep asking yourself why, maybe asking yourself 3 to 5 times. See where you end up. Ask yourself again, what is it that I'm interested in exactly? So, a lot of times we'll have general topics that we're really interested in, but what is it within this topic that you can do further research? And really asking yourself, how can I study further? So, why does it matter whether or not you have research questions? I like to quote one of the readings you have for this week, which is, if you try to do research without research questions, you'll end up with a damnation of 10,000 index card, which I think a lot of you can relate given what you've gone through the past couple of weeks in your literature review and then summarizing, making sense of it all. So for me, you can type up keywords into a library database or Google Scholar all day long, get tons of information. But without that specific focus or questions to be answered, you're simply gathering up information aimlessly. It's like you're in the forest staring at trees after trees after trees without really knowing why you're there or what you're going to do with that. So if you're gathering up information for its sake, that's great. But if you're gathering up information for the purpose of doing research, you need to be able to analyze that information. So you'll need research questions to guide you through that in a meaningful way. Posing questions gives you and your readers a better vision of what you need in order to fulfill your research. Compare the two titles on this slide. At first glance, how effective do you think they are at helping the readers know what your research project is going to be about? If you start with just the first title, Treatment for Perfectionism, people may or may not know what you're talking about, but most likely they're not going to know what your research is going to be really focused on and delving deeper into. Versus the second title, and please don't judge my minute and a half worth of effort. Never feeling good enough. Effectiveness of using bibliotherapy in treating maladaptive perfectionism. I've embedded my research questions within the title. While it's not the full-blown explanation of what I'm asking, but essentially you probably could guess I'm trying to ask, how effective is using bibliotherapy as a modality in treating some aspects of maladaptive perfectionism? And using that, I can further elaborate on my research questions and give readers a much better sense in my introduction, just as some of the articles might have done a good job of in our activity last week in class. But being able to be much more focused, much more specific, gives you a better chance at asking a good research question and giving you a good title as a result. For this week, I'd really encourage you to practice coming up with various types of research questions for your interests and for your current topic. I think the best way to really refine it is to work through it on your own. And if you reach a bottleneck and you're like, I can't think anymore, I need some feedback, go ahead and email me and post on the discussion board. That way you can get feedback from me, from your classmates. And this is how we really grow when we are able to challenge each other and give feedback. Okay? Let's go ahead and get going. Let's go ahead and continue on the technicality of how you come up with good research questions and what are some good criteria to follow whenever possible. There are 4 criteria that I like to propose, and we'll go over them in the next 4 slides. Whenever possible, make it causal, specific, unambiguous, and falsifiable. Look for causal effects within relationships whenever you can. Although sometimes, depending on what you're really interested in and how you're asking the question, you might end up with how 2 things are related to each other without really knowing the directionality or causes of a particular phenomenon or construct. So, going back to our example topic, the manuscript that we read a couple of weeks ago on bibliotherapy and perfectionism, a question that we might be able to ask is what components of bibliotherapy are effective at decreasing perfectionistic discrepancy, negative affect, and stress among college students? And we can use that question to determine causality. Like what components is the independent variable, and then the 3 outcome variables or dependent variables are decreasing perfectionistic discrepancy, negative affect, and stress. And with this example, it'd be a quantitative approach that we're taking. So try out this particular criteria with your current topic. See if you can come up with a research question that looks at causality. Write it down and we can use it later for our discussion board. If something is specific, it is clearly defined and identified. You can start with general questions like what would be effective treatments for perfectionism? And then using that funnel approach again to try to ask who, when, how, and narrow down the scope and interest of your topic. You might then come up with how effective is bibliotherapy in treating maladaptive perfectionism for Asian American college students living in the Midwest 6 months after treatment? Your research questions should really follow the following criteria whenever possible to include the elements of time, space, level, and behavior. So the example of time would be is the duration of intervention, or if it's longitudinal, perhaps when the study started, when it ends, when are you still testing it? Space, is there any geographic boundary? In our example here, Midwest might be the space or research site per se that you're using. Level, is this at a local level, regional level, national level versus international? And then the final element is the behavior activity. It's usually the outcome that you're trying to measure and investigate. If we're using quantitative language, if we're using qualitative, it's essentially the central phenomenon. So with that said, I want to say that it's usually impossible to fit all of this in within your title, even 1 research questions. So you might develop multiple research questions within a research project. Or whenever you don't fit in the title, again, you can further elaborate on some of these elements within the introduction. But the key here is remember, be specific whenever you can. Something is ambiguous if it could potentially have 1 or more meaning. Unambiguous words are those that have clear opposites: good and bad, effective, ineffective, legal, illegal, useful, or useless. Compare interventions available for perfectionism versus is bibliotherapy effective at treating maladaptive perfectionism among college students in the US? So the former is broad enough to have various types of interpretation, as there might be different types of intervention, different treatments for perfectionism. There's different ways to define and conceptualize perfectionism depending on what theory you subscribe to. We don't really know in the first example who the treatment might be available for or effective for. Is it college students? Is it children, teenagers, older adults? So the second version of a question: is bibliotherapy effective at treating maladaptive perfectionism among college students in the US? It could probably use some more redefining, going deeper, but at least it's a better version of interventions available for treating perfectionism. So take a look at the articles we used for class last Thursday, or look at the ones that you've actually found for your literature review project. Find their research questions. See if you can spot whether they've used unambiguous words in their research questions. The last principle is that a research question should be falsifiable, meaning that it can be disproven. If you cannot prove or disprove something, it could be that the concept is too intangible or too poorly defined. And in that case, you don't really know if that concept determines or is related to anything. So be careful on that. One example of it could be if you're trying to pose a research question about power, but if you just leave it as that, power is something that's so intangible and could be up for interpretation that it cannot be disproven because of the nature of how you've defined it. So, just something to watch out for. So, now would be a good time to do a mini exercise. Using the four criteria that we just talked about, which of the following research question is phrased in a way that would make it an effective and good research question? Do students with high GPAs feel better about themselves than students with low GPAs? Do undergraduates with GPAs greater than 3.0 have higher self esteem than undergraduates with GPA of lower than 2.0? So, which one is it? Feel free to hit pause on the video if you need a moment to think about which one works best. Moving on to hypotheses. A hypothesis is a tentative and potential answer to the proposed research questions informed by existing literature and understanding of the problem. A lot of times you'd hear people refer to hypothesis as your best educated guess. So it's not just a hunch, intuition, or a random guess, but rather your best guess backed up by hopefully thorough understanding and investigation of current literature and what's come before. And a hypothesis has to be made before data collection. Otherwise, it's just a data driven response to the question. A hypothesis is posed in a way that's either supported or refuted, either or. So take a look at the research question and the corresponding hypothesis on the slide. What do you notice? So following the previous slide on hypothesis versus research question, take a look at the research question here. Does a counselor's sense of spirituality affect his or her own likelihood of suffering symptoms of compassion fatigue? So there are two ways you can make a hypothesis. Take a look at hypothesis 1. Counselors who are involved in regular religious activities report fewer symptoms of compassion fatigue. Hypothesis 2, who's tackling at the exact same thing, but notice the wording. Counselors who score at or above average on the spirituality inventory scale score lower on the counselor compassion fatigue inventory. So hypothesis 1 is using the constructs or the concept, the variables in itself, to talk about the research question and formulate their best guess based on it. Hypothesis 2 is using the measures. So they're making predictions about counselors who score higher on the spiritual inventory scales. They're predicting that these counselors would score lower on the counselor compassion fatigue inventory. Same thing, but this shows you that a hypothesis can be made in different ways, worded differently, coming from the same research question. So here I'll briefly go over the different types of hypotheses which you've most likely learned about in an undergraduate stats course. First off, null hypothesis. This is a statistical hypothesis used to determine whether the results of an experiment are statistically significant. So, if the null hypothesis is supported, it's essentially accepting that no relationship between two variables or there's no difference between them. So, in our example here, the null hypothesis is that high exposure to violent video games does not produce more antisocial behavior in elementary school children than low exposure. So, again, if this hypothesis is supported, we're essentially saying there's no statistical significant relationship between exposure to violent video games to antisocial behavior. So here the exposure to violent video game, that's the independent variable, the thing that's been manipulated or the thing that's changing. The outcome variable here, or the dependent variable, is antisocial behavior. Note the word that I used here was supported, if the null hypothesis was supported. Careful not to use the word proven, because it's really hard to prove a null hypothesis to be right, at least not by a single study. So it's impossible to prove a negative, is essentially the idea behind it. On the other side, if a null hypothesis is rejected, that means we're in favor of the experimental hypothesis and we're saying the results are statistically significant among these two variables. Then you'll dig a little deeper, which brings us to the second and third variable. The difference between them is the second one is non-directional versus the third is directional. Take a look at them. So after we reject the null hypothesis, if we're confirming a non-directional hypothesis, it says there's a significant difference, but we don't really know which direction it's swaying in. We're saying elementary school children with high exposure to video games are different than those with low exposure, but we're not saying if they have higher or lower antisocial behavior. Versus if we're confirming a directional hypothesis, we're making prediction that a specific group or condition will have higher or more something. So after talking a lot about hypotheses and research questions and the similarity amongst these two, I'm guessing some of you might ask, when should I use a hypothesis versus a research question? Let's talk about hypotheses first. It's useful to use hypotheses if there's already a lot of established research in that area and you're able to predict an outcome based on what you know in the literature. If you can anticipate that in advance, particularly remember you need to make a hypothesis before you collect data. A lot of times, if you already have a theory or a model in place and you want to test a component of it, making a hypothesis can be easier. However, the downside of it is it could blind you as a researcher to unanticipated results because you already think you know what's going to happen. But what if the opposite happens? How do you explain that? Versus, let's talk about research questions. It's useful to use this if there's very little research previously done on the topic. A lot of times, if you hear the words like exploratory, you'll most likely hear research questions being stated in the manuscript versus hypothesis. The benefit of it is it allows you as a researcher to conduct more open-ended inquiries. So you'll probably see research questions posed a lot more in qualitative or mixed methodologies. So the good thing about research question is that you can report a wide range of outcome. However, follow the similar logic. Sometimes the critique of it is, as a researcher, you might be asking more open-ended questions as a fishing expedition, or you're just trying to manipulate the results to find something significant. So just use that as a frame of work to help you distinguish when to use a hypothesis versus a research question. So this wraps up our lecture for this module. Hopefully that was helpful. If you like to do additional reading, they will be included on Canvas. Feel free to go back to Creswell's text as well. He has a chapter on research questions and hypothesis, which I believe was in chapter 7 of the PDF. So feel free to go back to that. The task for this week would be to continue your literature review on your own topic, refine it further. Email me or come to me during office hours if you have more questions. But we have a discussion board this week, so be sure to go to that before Friday to fill out your initial post and then come back to brainstorm with your classmates, give them comments, give them feedback, be inspired by what someone else is doing, or struggle together and commiserate. Either way, don't struggle in silence. I am always here to facilitate this process. And I really feel like you would learn these concepts best by trying it out on your own research or on the articles that I've provided in the past couple of weeks. So I hope to talk to you all soon. Again, I'm here if you have questions. Take care.